Evidence-based practice is essentially three things. It's an integration of the best evidence available, so that's your research, nursing expertise, so that's where you bring in your experiences as a nurse, and the values and preferences of the individuals, families, and communities who are served. So when you think about this, the common examples that come up is that oftentimes one of these three elements is missing when it's not evidence-based practice. So a lot of times you have a nurse who has experience that is maybe contrary to the best evidence, or you have a patient's preference that is contrary to what the most recent evidence is, um, or you have people who are practicing outside of what the evidence says. And so you need all three of those elements present in order to call it evidence-based practice. If even one is missing, then it doesn't really fit the definition. Some examples include Jehovah's Witnesses and blood transfusion. So even though your nursing expertise and the research might say that the patient needs a blood transfusion, if their spiritual views or religious views prohibit them from having that transfusion, then you should not give them that transfusion, and doing so would not be evidence-based practice. So in the process of evidence-based practice, you want to ask a relevant searchable question. So this is a research question that you can query a database like CINAHL and find articles for. An example would be inpatients in an ICU, does a heparin lock have any benefit to the patient over a saline lock in terms of preventing clotting and or other adverse effects. Then you're going to systematically search the evidence. So you're going to go and you're going to do a review of the literature, usually through multiple databases, and you're going to keep track of what search terms you're using through that process. You're going to examine the evidence and evaluate its relevance to your topic, how recent it is, whether or not they had any threats to validity, what type of data did they have, was it significant, were their methods good. You're going to change your practice if the research suggests that changing the practice is necessary. And then after you change your practice, you're going to evaluate the effect of that change. And if the effect of the change is what you anticipated and it's in line with the research, then you would maintain that change. So you may be asking yourself why we need evidence-based practice, and the evidence is fairly straightforward. So the Crossing the Quality Chasm, the IOM report in 2001, essentially said that we need to implement evidence-based practice so that we can improve the quality of our care. There are a lot of gaps between theory and practice, and those gaps diminish the quality of patient care. They diminish its efficiency, and it leads to a long delay between when new evidence is discovered and when it's actually translated into practice. And so another IOM report, To Err Is Human, which was quite famous and you're probably already familiar with, essentially said that there are so many errors in healthcare that lead to so many injuries and deaths in a given year that depending on which numbers you read, it's either a jumbo jet a day or 4 jumbo jets a week crashing. That's the number of deaths in healthcare that are related to medical error that can be prevented by better processes and more evidence-based practice. So the way that evidence-based practice improves care is that it's supported by research, so you know that there's data behind it that backs up the interventions that you're practicing. But with technology especially, there's been such an explosion of knowledge. So there's so much more research being published today than there used to be. And the sheer quantity of information makes it really hard to keep up. But the goal of evidence-based practice is, it provides a means to standardize the way that you provide care. So that all nurses or all doctors, for example, are providing care to a standard. And so in other words, evidence-based practice sort of sets the bar that all clinicians have to meet. It improves adherence to practices that we know work, and it makes data available at the bedside for the clinician when it's needed so that they can make better decisions. So the current status of evidence-based practice is essentially that there's a lot of knowledge out there. There are a ton of articles that are published and are widely available, especially when you have access through a university like UDM. However, the biggest gap is in how it gets translated into practice. So there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it still isn't being put into practice yet. There is a growing expectation by employers that evidence-based practice is part of everyday clinical practice, and this includes policies in hospitals and offices, and also oftentimes it's part of your clinical letter and how you develop as a professional nurse. However, many nurses, and especially so nurses with associate's degrees and not bachelor's degrees, oftentimes don't have comfort or the skills, and I would say all nurses probably don't have the time in their normal working hours to access appropriate materials. So to go online and search the databases or read journals that have up-to-date evidence-based information so that they can start to learn that information and put it into practice. So to promote evidence-based practice, really, an organization needs to make it a core part of their philosophy and mission. The administration, from essentially the CEO all the way down to your nursing manager, needs to commit to an emphasis on evidence-based practice, and that it's going to be part of your work culture and part of how you accomplish your work as a nurse or a physician or a pharmacist or any clinical or non-clinical person, frankly, in a health organization. It needs to be integrated throughout. The environment and the culture needs to be such that critical thinking is promoted, and that as a nurse you are empowered to have autonomous decision making, especially with your nursing care plans, and especially with the ability to speak up and voice a concern if you think that the care a patient is getting is not meeting the standard that the evidence has set. All staff should also be introduced to evidence-based practice, so hopefully even if you didn't get education in how to look up research articles or evaluate an article for its quality, hopefully all clinical staff within an organization should be introduced to some resource that the organization has purchased as a source of good information for nurses or other clinicians. And so the organization should provide you with the tool and access, and in these times it's usually in the form of a link on your computer or an application on your computer that you can go in and search a particular drug or search for a diagnosis or a set of circumstances and then find appropriate, up-to-date, curated evidence that's easy for you to read and then make a clinical decision based off that information. So when you're searching for literature in databases for evidence-based practice, you want to make sure that you record your search details. So keep track of all the keywords that you used and what types of articles were returned, how many, their quality, whether or not they were on topic. Keep notes of the author, the title of the article, the types of studies, the findings of those studies, and what the authors recommended in terms of applying that information to clinical practice. As a general rule, systematic reviews, meta-analyses of relevant randomized controlled trials are usually considered sort of the gold quality. Those are the highest quality evidence that you can find. So randomized controlled trials, systematic reviews, or meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials are really what you're looking for. Although in this course, generally speaking, if you can find something that's relevant, on topic, and has some sort of data analysis, I'm generally going to give you credit for that. And you'll hone your skills at being able to determine if a study is of high quality or not as you progress through your degree. So when you're searching online for evidence in one of these databases, it gives you the opportunity to identify and or refine your topic. So oftentimes you sort of get feedback based on what you're searching, what some other key terms are, And a lot of times you can refine sort of the item that you're looking for based on what you're finding in the research. You can retrieve full text articles, and so you have access to many full text articles as part of your enrollment here at UDM. Determine appropriate sample size. An appropriate sample size really depends on what type of study you're doing, but generally speaking, you're going to want to look for a larger sample size more so than a smaller one. So a sample size of only, let's say 5 patients as an example, generally speaking, is going to be less meaningful than a sample size of 500 patients. Data collection and analysis is really important. Generally speaking, if you have a control, that's good, and if there's randomization, single or double blind in randomization, those are all really good things. And the point of those efforts is to try to control the data so that it's not influenced by outside forces or variables. And the control is really to isolate particular variables and try to determine cause and effect. Some deficits we have today are that many nurses in practice have never learned how to search an electronic database. And so you may not have been aware of CINAHL or PubMed or other databases before being in this program. And hopefully, as you progress through this program, you learn additional skills in terms of how to find high-quality articles and get access to them and cite them appropriately and evaluate them for if they have good content and if they're on topic. Generally speaking, a lot of nurses aren't able to differentiate between true research studies and other types of published literature. And oftentimes, a lot of what is available in CINAHL is what I would consider true research, and others are expert opinion type papers that still have a lot of value, but you need to be able to differentiate between the two. And a lot of nurses, you can read the study and read the findings and apply it, but you may or may not have the ability to critically evaluate these reports and determine if their methods were of high quality. So really quickly, we'll talk about quantitative and qualitative research. Generally speaking, quantitative is objective instead of subjective, and it can be measured oftentimes numerically with structured questions. So one of the classic examples you'll see is like a survey with a Likert type scale of, rank this 1 to 5 would be quantitative data. Qualitative is subjective, and it's focused on meanings, concepts, definitions, characteristics, symbols, descriptions, and generally the method is an interview or a focus group. So just sort of as a classic comparison, if you're collecting data from subjects and you're doing interviews, generally speaking, that's qualitative data. And if you give them a survey with standard questions to fill out with ranked numerical scores, then that would be quantitative. Now, data analysis, once you've collected your qualitative or quantitative data, is a process of taking the data and identifying trends or patterns. And so, remember before when we talked about data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, data analysis is essentially where you take the data and you turn it into information and knowledge. And so this is really a foundational piece of what informatics is. It's facilitated through statistical analysis, so finding if there's a relationship between two pieces of data, if one is an independent variable or a dependent variable, determining if there's statistical significance to that relationship. These are really basic functions of statistical analysis, which is how we come to conclusions based on the raw numerical and or qualitative data that we have available to us. And data mining and knowledge discovery in databases is just another way to describe the skill set that we're using to detect patterns when we're using really, really large sets of data. So here's a quick slide on useful databases and resources. I would just add into this that I think that you should sort of by default, because you're nurses in this class and because it's a relatively user-friendly website to use, is that CINAHL is a really good database to start with. So start there, look for your articles there, and especially if you're looking in the field of nursing, you're likely to find the data you're looking for. If you can't find what you're looking for, go ahead and check out these other websites. Just Google these terms, and you'll be able to find these databases relatively quickly. Uniform languages are really important for evidence-based practice and research, and we're going to talk about them at the end of the semester. But think of them as a standardized way to collect terms so that they're understood, measured, coded across different settings. And so it's also really important when we talk about integrating multiple systems together so that they can talk together, so to speak. It's important to have a common language, and the same concept is true when you're talking about data. So they facilitate data collection, they add to the overall body of nursing knowledge, and the two most widely accepted standards in nursing are SNOMED and ICMP. And you'll see that SNOMED is actually one of the sort of government-endorsed coding standards, and it's used a lot in current regulation, which we'll again talk about a little bit later in the semester. So some impediments or barriers to advances in healthcare research are slow adoption of data exchange standards. So some of that has been improved in the last few years since this book was published, but still getting everyone on the same standardized terminologies and the same interface structure so that we can share information is really important and is currently an issue. Failure to realize the birth to death EHR. So our EHRs are still very much episodic and based on single instances of care delivery. Limited interoperability and information exchange. Again, healthcare providers, whether hospitals or doctors' offices or even insurance companies, are not doing a really great job of sharing data with one another so that the data can be aggregated and analyzed. There are concerns over confidentiality, so people are less willing to share their personal information for fear that it'll be divulged to persons against their will, or it will be hacked or leaked or made available to someone in a way that violates their privacy. Research takes money, and so oftentimes there's limited funding for studies that should be completed. Everything has a cost associated with it. And there's, again, concerns about sharing information, not just from the patient, but also from organization to organization. So one of the advantages that we have with all the technology today is that research can be disseminated really quickly. And so you can really speed it up with email inquiries. I can email a journal with a study that I'm doing and see if they have interest in publishing it. I can submit all my files to them electronically, and they can publish that article electronically without ever putting it into paper print. And I only have one article published, and that's exactly how the group that I worked with did it. We reached out to a journal and submitted our information and emailed back and forth a few times, and the whole process was done in just a few months. You can use a bibliography database manager or program. Microsoft Word actually does it inherently. You don't need to buy anything extra. And you can keep track of all of the articles that you're citing as you're preparing to write your paper, your research paper. And publishing things online makes it possible to share results of your research without going through traditional routes, which are much slower. So why is this important to you as a student, in addition to being important to you as a nurse? Really, it's because you can benefit from the internet and find a lot of information that supports your education and enhances your ability to learn and also produce content, whether it's discussion boards or wiki assignments in my class or research papers in your other classes. And informatics competencies are necessary to the development of evidence-based practice and research skills. And so being information literate and being health literate, and then also being able to use a computer and navigate your computer and navigate with basic websites is really going to enhance your ability to find good, relevant clinical information and then translate that information into either a really good paper for school or an improvement to your clinical practice on the unit. So some really quick future directions. The electronic health record in your hospitals or office settings is really going to help provide data to support research and evidence-based practice. And really it's because there's so much data that's readily available in an electronic health record that used to have to be manually abstracted from paper charts. So there's much more data available. Integration of evidence-based practice guidelines into EHRs helps support clinicians and improve care and standardize care and make it more consistent. And the primary method that that's done through is called decision support, clinical decision support, which is essentially guidelines or rules and alerts placed in the system so that when a clinician tries to go outside the bounds of what we have programmed as what best care should be, it sort of tries to course correct and steer a clinician towards a decision that's based both on what the clinician thinks is right, but also infused with the most up-to-date research. And again, the EHR will change the way that information is collected and used. So we're collecting a lot more of it, and also as we adopt more of those standard terminologies that we talked about a few slides back, the way that we collect the data will be more consistent from EHR to EHR, and therefore more easy to aggregate and use big data sets for research purposes.